this next part of the lecture, we are going to look at how these negative experiences affected the Joseon state's decisions on its foreign relations, not only with Western countries, China and Japan, but also to see how this affected and changed traditional relations between the Joseon dynasty and Japan. So if we look at traditional relations between Joseon and Tokugawa Japan, we'll see that although Japan was operating outside of the tributary system, Joseon did have limited interaction with the Japanese. And so there is some interaction, however, they try to keep it to a minimum because, again, the Japanese were considered to be outside of the tributary system, and thus they were the Eastern barbarians. And so they were treated very differently from the way that Joseon interacted with China. So while Joseon had a very close relationship with China and interacted quite frequently with them, their interactions with Japan were rather limited. So as the Western imperialist powers began to enter into the area, they implemented gunboat diplomacy. So when the Westerners were in China and the Opium War broke out, which the Qing dynasty eventually lost, the British then imposed upon China an unequal treaty. And this unequal treaty was basically something that favored Britain and put China at a great disadvantage, but China had to agree to sign to it because they had lost at this war. And if they didn't agree to sign it, then they would be subject to more military aggression. The same thing happened with Japan in a slightly different way. So the Americans, which is pictured here, the Americans sent in their black ships into Japan because the Americans wanted to sign a treaty. And just like the Joseon dynasty, the Tokugawa had limited relations with outside countries. And so when the Americans arrived under the command of Commodore Perry in the 1850s, the Japanese did not want to sign a treaty with the Americans, but Commodore Perry basically forced them to and said, if you do not sign this, then we're going to blow you up. And so this is called gunboat diplomacy, and the result of gunboat diplomacy is often the signing of unequal treaties. Now, let's look a little bit deeper into how the Joseon dynasty viewed Japan. So, because they were not a part of the tributary system, they were operating outside of it. But one of the main reasons that they operated outside of the tributary system and were not included in it was because they called their ruler the emperor. But within the tributary system, there can only be one emperor, and that one emperor resides in China. So for Japan to call their ruler an emperor, it was considered to be lacking civilization and to be very barbaric. You know, they were uneducated and they did not know that they could not also call their ruler the emperor, and so this was why they were, one of the reasons why they were excluded from the tributary system. Joseon, which was a vassal state, they called their ruler the king, because this is their way of acknowledging that the one true emperor is the Chinese emperor. So as a result, Joseon had very limited interaction with Japan, And this interaction was limited to Tsushima, the island of Tsushima, and the House of Wa in Busan. So the Joseon dynasty allowed for a certain amount of trade to occur, and certain Japanese officials were allowed to come to Busan at the southeastern coast of Korea, but they were not allowed to go any further into the interior of Joseon, and the Japanese officials, including the emperor, did not have direct communication with the Korean king. So it was, while the Joseon dynasty had a hierarchical relationship with China where they took a superior position, in this case we see that also there is a certain amount of hierarchical relations involved. However, Japan wants to begin to revise their relations with the Joseon dynasty after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. So after Japan had been opened up by Commodore Perry, they realized that we are vulnerable. We have been exposed in terms of our lack of military strength. We were subject to having to sign this unequal treaty, and because we were not able to defend ourselves, Japan decided that they were going to shore up their military. So they really focused on industrialization and modernizing their military following the Western imperialist model. So this occurred all around this time, and after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, they realized that it would be to their best advantage if they were the first to establish trade with the Joseon dynasty. So they wanted to approach the Joseon dynasty, ask the Joseon dynasty to revise their foreign relations so that they had more one-to-one contact from sovereign to sovereign. But the Koreans were not interested in revising their relations, and the Koreans were just fine with the status quo. Yoshika Inoue was born to a samurai family in the Satsuma domain. And he was the captain of the Unyo, which was a ship that is commissioned to sail to Joseon in order to start the revision process in foreign relations. Now, he is a seasoned military veteran. He had fought in the Boshin War against the Tokugawa shogunate and participated in the modernization process for Japan. In 1872, he became a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and he was a supporter of Seikanon, which was this idea that Korea needed to be punished or that Korea needed to be opened up, and that Korea had for too long kept Japan at bay and excluded them and treated them rather in a demeaning manner. So in 1875, he leads the gunboat, sails it over to Busan without any advance notice to the Koreans. And so then they are fired upon, and he then sails around to Kangwa Island, claiming that this is a coastal survey. Now, you may remember that previous Westerners had also arrived on Kangwa Island, and what had happened? They were fired upon. Those are restricted waters, and they are not allowed entrance, because once you head up the Han River, that takes you directly to the capital. So, knowing that they would be fired upon, he still sails towards Kangwa Island, and there is no national flag for identification. And so after warning shots are fired upon them, the Unyo fires back, and there is a firefight that ensues. So the Japanese army ends up capturing the base there and setting it on fire. And then the next day, the Unyo attacks another base, resulting in casualties on the Korean side. So using this as a pretense, the Japanese said, "You fired upon us, you have killed some of our people, so we demand an official apology from the Joseon government. I'm going to return in a year with a treaty, and so you must sign this, otherwise we're going to fire upon you." So basically, Japan had learned from the West gunboat diplomacy, and they were implementing the same gunboat diplomacy that they had been a victim of, and now they are subjecting the Joseon dynasty to it. Now I'll introduce you to Kuroda Kiyotaka, who was also born into a samurai family, also fought in the Boshin War against the Tokugawa shogunate, and he, under the Meiji government, he was able to colonize Hokkaido. So in 1876, 1 year after the Unyo incident, he's dispatched to Joseon as a special envoy. And there he goes to discuss the aftermath of the Kangwa incident or the Unyo incident. And after several negotiations, he demands an apology and presents this unequal treaty to the Joseon state. And he is acting as a representative of the Japanese government. As far as the Joseon officials were concerned, they didn't really understand how gunboat diplomacy and these unequal treaties worked. So they're presented with the Kangwa Treaty, they're told that they must sign it or else they're going to be subject to military aggression again. So they decide to sign it. And they thought that this would temporarily appease the Japanese. But what this effectively does is it opens Korea's ports, 3 of them to be specific, for the first time to outside trade. It also establishes the Joseon dynasty as an independent state with all the sovereign rights. So what we have here is Japan attempting to negotiate a treaty, force Joseon to sign this treaty that is based on Western international law, where all states are considered to be equal, and thus severing the tributary relationship between Joseon and the Qing dynasty, because by the Joseon dynasty declaring its independence, this would then symbolize that the tributary system had ended. But the Joseon officials did not really understand this. So there are various aspects to the treaty that are agreed upon, such as the exchange of envoys, the opening of 3 ports, including Incheon, Busan, and Wonsan. And the Kangwa Treaty also gives Japan certain advantages because they are the first country to open up Korea to trade. And so it allows for the Japanese to send merchants and for the merchants to set up residence in the ports. And it ensures that the Joseon state is not going to interfere in trade. And so this really gives Japan first mover advantage for signing this treaty and being able to trade freely in the Joseon dynasty.